Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clements, Editor-at-Large of The Hill. Thank you for joining us today for Energy Efficiency and Climate Justice, an in-depth discussion on environmental justice and the Biden administration's policy priorities in that area. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Climate Action Campaign, for supporting today's conversations. The devastating effects of climate change, exposure to pollution, and lack of access to clean, affordable energy have created a lot of economic and health disparities across the country, particularly in Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities. On his first day in office, President Biden laid out an ambitious agenda to address the climate crisis. On today's program, we're going to examine the administration's policy priorities around environmental justice and pollution-free energy infrastructure. We're going to explore how Americans can have access to clean air, water, and sustainable housing. And we're going to pose these questions and more to administration officials, advocates, and sustainable energy experts. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us, and I hope you do tweet us, at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillClimate. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program, so send them our way. And as with any live stream, I love and hate this part. You can push refresh if your page goes wonky, and it will fix everything, just believe me. Now let's dive right in. Joining me to discuss how the administration is ushering in a clean energy revolution and bringing justice to communities subjected to environmental harm is Brenda Mallory, chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Brenda, it's really great to talk with you. Now, I have to say it's been some years since I've heard a lot of conversations at the same time where in the same sentence we're talking about justice and trying to get climate. Maybe you can help our viewers understand why the connection of those two in a single sentence, in a single mission, is so important.
Absolutely. And first of all, Steve, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this program. One of the things that's so exciting about President Biden's agenda is that he is, for, in really the first time, bringing those issues together. He's established an agenda that has made its anchor pillars around connecting climate and justice and jobs. And those three things run through everything that we're doing because, in fact, those three things are important for stabilizing the country and for making sure that we can move forward in an economy that works for everyone.
How big a lift is it? I'm going to name drop. This is D.C. We embrace that. But I ran into Ernie Moniz, our former energy secretary, and he's involved with something called the Energy Futures Initiative. He was on the street in Washington walking by. I said, Mr. Secretary. And he's out there and has been pushing, even before the election of President Biden, an energy jobs coalition to say, look, at the retrofitting, as we look at this, we can connect that important climate agenda to the fact that we're coming out of a pandemic, one of the biggest, economic shocks the country has had at the same time, and try and connect these equations. Is there any piece of this that you've been seeing that kind of follows some of that track of an energy jobs coalition, essentially?
Well, I do think that there are a lot of great ideas that have been shared over the recent years that really recognize that it's important to be thinking about how we rebuild the economy in this country in a way that is going to benefit everyone. And the clean energy is so important, not just because of the climate challenge, but because it does present the opportunity for us to rebuild our manufacturing sector and other areas of the economy in a way that will have a stabilizing force, but also prepare us for the future.
One of the key initiatives that I think you have helped launch and President Biden has helped launch, so we'll give him credit first, but I know that you've been pushing it, is the Justice 40 initiative. Can you share with us what the contours of that are? And can you share with us why it matters so much when it comes to putting this country back together again? Because one of the things I'm really worried about is the political toxicity in this country, getting people to care about each other, having empathy. And that may require us to know that there were a lot of people that were not benefiting from the way things were before. So tell us about Justice 40.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just say this is President Biden's agenda. And so there's no me talking about what I'm doing that's separate from him, to be clear.
Okay.
The president throughout the campaign and really in the first days of the administration established the Justice 40 initiative. And it's a reflection of a commitment to make sure that the federal investments in clean energy, and climate change related programs and activities result in 40% of the overall benefits going to low income and communities of color. And that is a direct result of recognizing that for so long, we have not provided or made sure that all communities have benefited from federal investments. And I think it's a step that not only will address some of our climate issues, but it also helps to try to bring these communities that are definitely behind in many ways, forward in their ability to grow and to recover from some of the legacy pollution that they're suffering.
One of the topics that I discussed recently was in a program that was actually funded by the Environmental Defense Fund, and I interviewed Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and we were kind of looking at the trucking industry and what was happening as more e-trucks are coming online. And as you begin looking at what needs to be retrofitted by way of charging stations and all of this, she is very committed to going into these same neighborhoods that have been neglected and left on the sidelines of progress and saying we need to build that in. Now, I know that this is a small part of the bigger topic that you're talking about, but it seemed to me that that was, on the mind and the sort of dashboards of other members of Congress as we sort of shape and sculpt what we're doing by way of energy efficiencies in the future and climate and trucking. Are you working with her? Is the White House hearing about these initiatives, about trying to marry, our future energy development with communities that have been neglected in the past?
I think absolutely. I mean, we are in contact with our allies on the Hill in a variety of different ways. And, many of the ideas that are reflected in Justice 40 as an example, but in other parts of the agenda, are ideas that have been percolating for several years and are coming from, as I said before, from a variety of places. And so when you think about the Justice 40 initiative, which, does a number of things, but is targeted on looking at things like lead in drinking water, looking at establishing better energy efficiency in rural communities, looking at how you can impact some of the housing problems that exist. Like all of these are programs that are within the 21 projects or programs that are set up for the first pilot in the Justice 40 initiative. And they not only affect kind of energy and energy efficiency related things and other direct climate activities, but they also deal with these historic problems that have been plaguing communities for so long.
One of the things I've been thinking about since the Biden administration came in is that we had 4 years of the Trump administration on a lot of these areas. I don't know how to politely call it. There was regression. Some stuff went the other way. I mean, we'll just, be frank about that. But if you looked at the towns and the states, and you looked at red states, you looked at blue states, you looked at companies that were out there. I remember being at an international conference with former Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who said, if the federal government is abdicating its responsibility, there are lots of other players that can play this. So I guess my question to you is, during a time when the kind of agenda that you have was not getting the attention and support previous to the Biden administration, how resilient was the energy and climate justice picture nationally, lower level in our nation? Does that make sense? Am I communicating that well enough?
I know what you're trying to get at. Why don't I start? And if I'm not actually addressing it, then you can sort of steer me away. I mean, I think basically what I would say, and just as Mr. Bloomberg said, I mean, one of the things that happened in the last 4 years is that you did see some states and some local communities really stepping up in recognition that they needed to fill that void, that they needed to not only step in where you would expect the federal government to be playing a role, but to do so in sort of a progressive way that is actually moving the agenda forward so that when the feds came back, that they could, that they would have some additional progress to make up. And so I do believe that, when you look across the country at some of the initiatives that were occurring in different places, that they showed sort of progress along issues that we are now picking up, both in terms of climate, but also in terms of ideas on, the Justice 40 being an example. I mean, that is an approach that New York was implementing in its state. And there are many ideas that are relevant. It's not the same, but of course there's some synergy there that I think enables us to sort of talk about it and think about it in a more developed way than if we were starting from scratch.
That's amazing. We're taking questions from our audience, and we have one here for you from Jody. Jody?
Hi, my name is Jody London. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator in Contra Costa County in the San Francisco Bay Area. My question is, what is the administration doing to expand eligibility for weatherization and related programs? In our experience, expanding eligibility for weatherization and expanding the program requirements is an easy and effective way to reduce energy bills and improve health for people who are least able to participate otherwise in these programs. Thanks.
Thank you, Jody. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that, as we are thinking about rolling out, Justice 40, as well as just more broadly about how in each of the agencies, through a whole of government approach, that we are able to, deliver on the full agenda of ensuring that we're addressing the needs of disadvantaged communities. We recognize that there are places in our programs where the barriers are associated with the criteria or the implementation of criteria that give people access to some of the programs. So that's definitely an area where the agencies are looking at their programs and seeing what opportunities exist for some flexibility. Now, there are places where it's statutory, and so obviously you're going to have you have more limits on what you can do there. But where it's not driven by statute, we can more quickly address the things that are within the discretion of the agency. And for those things that are driven by statute, then it can go on the list of things that we need to put forward for Congress to address.
Let me just, sneak one last final one in. In years past, I have spent a lot of time with Anthony Fox, a former transportation secretary, former mayor, and he kind of helped educate me, and I think many Americans, that many of our infrastructure decisions that we made in the past divided communities, were fundamentally racist, left people out of that equation, and we've got to address that and fix that. And I'm going to, ask you that as we think about this question of climate and justice, which also it means a lot of infrastructure, and we're at an inflection point, I think, in those discussions. Can we undo a lot of that damage seriously in your gut, or do you think this is something that's going to take us, a lot more work and effort to get by?
Well, I would say that, it depends on the place, right? Now, the president has very specifically included within the agenda the idea of trying to undo and fix areas in which communities were harmed by the bisecting of, established communities. But I think whether it works and how it works will really depend on the locations. And so I think there is a kind of an openness and, a motivation to kind of look and examine and see what our opportunities are. But, it will obviously depend on what the circumstances are on the ground, what the communities themselves at this point want, whether that's a value add or is at this point disruptive in and of itself. And I'm sure that might be true in some cases, as opposed to just assuming that the right answer is to just undo something that was put in place previously, that now people have already built up new, both, actual infrastructure, but also like community supportive, structures around.
Well, Brenda Mallory, Chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, this was fun and illuminative, and I look forward to you coming back, if you will, and tell us how the Justice 40 initiative is going down the road and looking at the impact that you're making on the broad side of environmental quality and these very, very important justice issues. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me.
And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Please welcome Peggy Shepard, co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice. She's in conversation with Flo McAfee, president of Summerland Studios. Flo, over to you.
Hello, I'm Flo McAfee, president of Summerland Studio, a strategic communications firm focused on social impact issues. We work very closely with Climate Action Campaign, CAC, on issues focused on reducing climate pollution and accelerating a just transition to clean energy and a sustainable society that supports justice, jobs, improved health, quality of life for all. CAC is a coalition of major national environmental justice, and public health groups. One of their invaluable partners is We Act for Environmental Justice. So today joining us is Peggy Shepard, co-founder and president of We Act and co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Thank you, Peggy, for joining us today, and thank you very much for your partnership with CAC and all the good work that your organization has done on a daily basis throughout the years. So to open this up, I really want to ask you to really tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got involved not only in climate and environmental justice, but why you co-founded We Act.
Well, you know, I began as a journalist and a magazine editor and used my skills to work in political campaigns, especially the Jesse Jackson's first campaign for president, which was a very, very exciting time, organizing the Rainbow Coalition here in New York City and working with young people in every borough, you know, really feeling like we had an opportunity to create a new political paradigm. And so that's how I really began working in more of a political environment. We Act got started in 1988 because of these campaigns, but also our campaign to sue the Metropolitan Transit Authority for building another bus depot in our community. We realized that we housed over 1/3 of the largest diesel bus fleet in the country in our uptown neighborhoods in Manhattan. And so we filed a suit there. We were not successful in that lawsuit, but we were able to stop housing being built on top of a bus depot. And so over the years, we have evolved from, you know, stopping the bad stuff and being a watchdog to being able to work on a full range of environmental issues centering justice and equity, and really understanding our theory of change, which is to organize the most affected people of color and low income to engage in environmental decision making.
I think what you discuss leads to a really important question that I think we need to help people understand. As you mentioned, in our communities, it's well documented and really visually evident that some of the most polluted environments in America are where people of color live, where they learn, where they work, play, and pray. Could you explain why that is the case?
You know, we have a complex legacy of housing segregation, redlining, land use and zoning, discrimination in so many ways. And we call it environmental racism because polluting facilities have intentionally targeted communities of color for pollution because we are not as knowledgeable about those issues. Our elected officials haven't been active on those issues. And so as a result, there's been discrimination in the enforcement of environmental regulation. Again, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste disposal and a whole variety of polluting facilities. The continued permitting of polluted facilities in overburdened communities, and the exclusion of people of color and low income from the staff and board of mainstream environmental groups that have really created so much of the policy in this community, in this country, and also our exclusion from decision-making boards and regulatory bodies. And so all of this really comes together in a perfect storm.
I think that's interesting, leads to my next question. As a member of and as the co-chair of the White House Council, Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and as one who's been in the political arena, what do you see the Biden administration's policy priorities around environmental justice and really reaching that pollution-free energy infrastructure?
Well, I think the centerpiece of the Biden administration has been Justice 40. That's certainly an initiative that so many people have heard about. And that's really an effort to ensure that 40% of the benefits of energy investments go to frontline communities that have been so disinvested in over many, many years. And so that is a way to begin to invest in communities. Invest in what? So invest in ensuring that underserved people have good jobs, family-sustaining jobs, ensuring that we have the energy efficiencies that we need as we switch from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable one. We have to ensure that the most overburdened communities are taken into account when we're developing policies, because we already know 30 million households in this country are already energy insecure. And so when we begin our transition, we have to ensure that that burden does not fall on the most vulnerable communities.
Great. And I think that's important too for people to understand, and perhaps you can help explain what will be the cost of inaction, because people over inaction on terms of the climate change and even in environmental justice. I think it's helpful for people to understand that too.
The cost of inaction is new generations and new families sickened and dying in the cancer alleys that occur across this country. It's Gulf Coast communities of color wiped out by extreme hurricanes and flooding that's not addressed by really oppressive state governments that are not allocating equal funds to clean up and mitigate climate change and extreme weather events in communities of color. It's really understanding that if vulnerable communities are not represented in environmental decision-making, our communities will continue to be left out of the new energy economy and will continue to be overburdened by polluting facilities.
My last two questions is, number one, then how can communities and how does WEACT help communities get involved and be active, and what can they do? And then the final will be, what can Congress do? That's always to address the issue.
So what can communities do? There are hundreds of grassroots groups like WEACT for Environmental Justice around this country. WEACT is a membership-based organization. It's not enough just to organize people, but you've got to help them, inform them, train them to tell their story in a way that the media and policymakers can hear it best. Engage them in decision-making, in lobbying and educating their officials, bringing them to Washington to tell their story to Congress. So all of that is really important if we're going to fully integrate regular people who are most affected by these issues into policymaking. And then certainly Congress has a responsibility to fully represent all of our communities, and that has not been happening. We have a number of progressive bills pending in Congress that need to be passed. The Environmental Justice for All bill is very important. It would really create the kinds of engagement, the kinds of enforcement, the kinds of funding that is absolutely desperately needed in our communities.
Thank you so much, Peggy. This has really been informative and really helpful. Just before we close, could you remind people of how they can find out more about WEACT and where they could go?
Well, absolutely. You could always join WEACT as a member. We have monthly membership meetings and working groups around climate justice and healthy homes. You can go to our website at weact.org and find out more about us. And we also engage grassroots groups from around the country in an environmental justice leadership forum that also has meetings and annual convenings. So we'd love to have you all involved, but at least get involved in your locality. There are groups in your city and town that are working on these issues. Find them and work with them.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of CAC, I want to remind you, if you want to learn about what we do, go to actonclimate.org and you can find out more. Thank you so much, Peggy, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great discussion. Thank you both. And now I'd like to welcome our panel of experts, all of whom have been fighting for environmental justice for many years. Kim Foreman is the Executive Director of Environmental Health Watch in Cleveland and has been active in environmental justice work for nearly 2 decades. Ben Passer is the Lead Director of Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy, where he directs the nonprofit's work to advance equitable outcomes across Minnesota's energy system. But I need to congratulate him because he's leaving that job. And apparently, according to Twitter, he's going to the McKnight Foundation and joining their climate and energy team. So congrats on the new job. Sorry for the Fresh Energy folks, but hopefully everybody's happy in that. Jackie Patterson is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, the resource hub for Black Frontline climate justice leadership. Previously, she served for 11 years as the senior director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And finally, Adriana Quintero is senior director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Energy Foundation. Adriana is the founder of Voices Verde, one of the first organizations dedicated to building leadership among the Latinx community on sustainability. She also served on President Biden's Department of Energy transition team. It's really great to be with you. I can't imagine a better panel of people. We could solve all the problems on kind of climate and climate justice issues today between all 4 of you. But I want to have a serious discussion because when I think about this topic today and think about climate justice and how we get this right, I wonder if many Americans that are out there, and the majority of Americans, have this as a top-of-mind challenge because, we probably got there because it was not a top-of-mind challenge. And I just wonder, Kim Foreman, maybe where we should start is describing climate injustice. Give us an understanding, and I just want to read something to you that you said once. You said, look at any map. I don't care what you're talking about. From lead to asthma, environmental health issues to crime, to food deserts, it's all the same outline. And so I think it's maybe a useful starting place to talk about the legacy of climate injustice, and would love to kind of get a profile of that from all of you. So, Kim?
Hi, I think it's an injustice not to have folks impacted at the table at the beginning of a discussion to craft solutions, because those who are impacted by all of these issues, right? We don't segment the issues out there. Living the experience every day are compounded, right? So they should be at the table. We're developing projects, policy, ideas, solutions. And that's an injustice, I think, to the families and the folks who experience these issues, and folks flying into their communities, telling them what they should do, what they should be a part of, or giving them a stipend, and educating folks on things they already know and experience and have expertise in. The lived experience is the most important experience. And I think part of the issues around how we approach people of color, poor people in communities, is unjust in itself. It's not just about issues, is the actual involvement of people, which is part of the definition of environmental justice. It's not just about polluters or out the
Yeah, that's very helpful. And Jackie, I'd love to get the snapshot from you, but I want to add one layer to it, is that you tweeted out the NAACP's recent report, and it was called Nuts, Bolts, and Pitfalls of Carbon Pricing, an equity-based primer on paying to pollute. And one of the points of it was that this carbon pricing stuff that we're talking about, which we're not even at yet, actually doesn't solve the problems, which was something new that I hadn't thought about before, to be candid, because when you kind of look at, okay, how do we achieve, carbon limits and climate targets, and what we're also talking about is how do you make this this social and civic justice element also fit? And you said we can run the risk of actually doing things that may approach the climate which aggravate the social justice and distance. Am I getting that right?
Yes, definitely. So thank you for that. Thank you for looking at that report. It's always good to know people are reading. So so that's exactly it. Too often we engage in solutions that appear that we're only looking through one lens at the issue. And so, as Kim was saying, and as a quote from Audre Lorde, where she says, we don't we can't, let's say, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And similarly, when we think about solutions, we have to think about them in terms of what they're solving for and what they actually might be creating on the other side. And it's only through engaging frontline communities who actually are where we're all living. Where none of us live single issue lives, but communities who are on the front lines who experience the impacts that Kim has talked about of climate change and of environmental injustice are uniquely situated to be able to both talk about what the solutions are, as well as talk about unintended consequences for solutions that people raise through a myopic lens. So that's a little short.
There's so much here that we could go into in this, and I want to go into with all of you. But Ben, Fresh Energy, and I know you're leaving, but I mean, it sounds like this is an attempt with an independent nonprofit to go to Kim and Jackie's point to get those that are impacted at the table with utilities and with energy providers, so that there is at least a dialogue or discussion awareness. And I'd love to know if the model works, right? Are you there as a fig leaf? Are you there actually achieving something that you feel is substantial?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for your kind words. And just so happy to be here as part of this panel, and on behalf of Fresh Energy, actually staying in my current role for another month. So definitely still very much in it. I think in terms of our philosophy and what we try to do in our work, I think just to go back to Kim's earlier point, those maps are not a mistake. And I think one thing to really note right out of the outset is, I think throughout history, in times of transformational change, communities have been harmed or left behind either through malicious intent or the lack of intentionality. From the transportation sector and the construction of the federal interstate highway system that disproportionately impacted under-resourced communities and communities of color. In the housing sector, redlining disproportionately harmed, otherwise well-off communities of color, and really, I think segmented them into communities that we still see today. And so, as a policy organization, I think we have not just an opportunity, but an obligation to think about this transition, this huge energy transition, and how we are bringing communities along, not just as an afterthought, but as an inherent part of the process. So we really try to, bring that perspective to the processes that we are involved in, whether it's utility energy efficiency programs or the development of renewable energy policy. And I think importantly, really try to partner directly with community-based organizations, including folks who are, more well-versed on environmental justice, renter advocacy groups, and others, to really, leverage our power and privilege to bring them into the process and help them, speak directly to decision makers and others to really influence where our energy transition is going.
Now you're if I have it right, you're in St. Paul. Am I wrong on that?
That's correct.
And is it working?
That's a good question. I think, what I would say right off the bat is that this is a journey. And, I think I've heard a number of times, we can't really point to a time in U.S. history where there's been an equitable transition, right? And so I think we're really trying to think about how do we change these systems and these structures that have been built in a certain way. And so, I think we've seen signs of progress. We've recently passed legislation with our energy efficiency framework here in Minnesota that's going to have significant impacts and benefits for under-resourced households. And that was shaped with some of our community-based organizations, at the table and providing recommendations on that policy development. But I think we have a long way to go, and we really want to make sure that we're thinking about an equitable, just transition in Minnesota and across the U.S.
Well, thank you for that. And Adriana, I'd love you to respond too on this question of your depiction of climate injustice, But, I also just want to pay credit to you because, I know that your work on thinking about diversity and inclusion, this is in the last 2 years become such a big issue because we've seen what the pandemic has done, we've seen what the economy has done, we've seen what the stress over racial divisions and just, inequality in the country has just become, this bleeding ulcer and very evident in the country, right? So I've wondered, is there going to be a time we're actually going to be responding credibly on these fronts, or is this going to fade away like so many other times, and 2 years from now we will have just stuck our heads in the sand again? So I guess as I ask you about this, and with your work with the Energy Foundation, have you found a model? I mean, one of the things I think these programs are supposed to do is, are there replicable models where your work becomes easily copied by others? So what are your thoughts?
Great questions. And I'll point to everyone who has participated in this event as the models. This can't and should never be considered a trend or a passing fad. This is long overdue. As Ben just said, we don't have models because we truly have never seen this done well in our country. Inequity and the history of oppression and discrimination is there. And this is a really important moment where we have things coming together to truly keep this elevated and buoyed. And I think that as Peggy Shepard from WEAC just mentioned a few minutes ago, Justice 40 is one of those really important tools. And it really is based in a recognition that we have a history of discrimination and oppression that we need to very intentionally create policies against. And this is not something that's just going to happen coincidentally as an add-on. We need to be very intentional. And the models that WEAC, that Jackie has done throughout her career, that Ben and Fresh Energy have done, that Kim is moving forward, all of these and so many more that live in communities exist. We simply haven't been looking for them because the air has been taken out of the room by these large organizations who have done good work, but who have historically completely neglected and excluded the community voice and the community perspective, and the true knowledge of what one wants lives with our experience. I believe Kim said that very well. That is where our wisdom truly comes from. And I think what we're seeing now is a realization that that is where we need to really invest, and we need to put our energy in working with and alongside from the minute that the projects begin or beforehand, centering and elevating the needs of communities, the expertise that exists, even if it doesn't look like a diploma from some Ivy League university, that doesn't matter. What matters is the experience and the knowledge that's been gained living there, because that is truly where we're going to find the gains that have so long just eluded us. Where I think foundations, and I'm so glad that Ben is going to Foundation, fantastic. I look forward to working with you. What we can do is really invest and support the work that is going to be done at the federal level, at the state level. Even if we do our best at the federal level with Justice 40, the program is going to require groups on the ground and those to be funded and to be supported to make sure that the money goes where it's most needed. And I'm incredibly optimistic as to what can happen because of the energy that exists. We have to keep that going because we've spent hundreds of years getting here, and we need to invest the time and money in getting out of here.
Well, let me go to all of you and go back to Kim and Jackie to start with, but I don't know. I mean, I've been doing a variety of programs on this front, and one recently supported by the Environmental Defense Fund, as I mentioned with Brenda Mallory, about electronic vehicles, and I interviewed Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, who's been trying to work on some of these same questions of neglected, underserved, communities that have just been carrying the burden of climate disaster, if you will. I'm probably saying this all wrong, but trying to do it. And I guess the question is, I've heard for the first time about this Justice 40 initiative. Does that begin tilting us in the right direction, or do you think that is, I have this worry that sometimes we get caught up in fads, and I just wonder if they're real. But Kim, is Justice 40 a start for you, and how much more do we need to do?
Right. So I think every conversation, everything is a great start. The question is application, right? So we get these documents, we get these proposals, we get the conversations. Now, how do we transition to application and looking at resources, looking at budgets, right? Where do the dollars go and what impact is it going to make, and make sure we're not just reverting back to programs, and also not just listing out what we think sounds good, but how are we really evaluating what's happening on the ground in a real way and not just lean on gatekeepers to tell us the story. Right. We have to dig deeper. And like Adriana said, to be intentional. Every day is an evaluation. So we don't wait 2 years later to evaluate whether it's worked or not. We're going to constantly ask the question.
Jackie, let me say something nice about our supporters today, the Climate Action Campaign, because they really care about this issue, and I'm glad they do. And as I've just been listening to all of you and thinking about, the conversation we heard with those during the sponsored content session, I'm just sort of asking myself, how do you take the communities we're talking about them and make them winners and not losers? So, and is climate action, how do I put this? Is climate action something that, to a certain degree, the Black and brown communities can embrace and they can see themselves being wired in with a better social contract rather than distrusting and seeing themselves as victims again? So how do we get that going the right way, Jackie?
Yes, thank you. So first we have to think about so too often what we find is there's a recent campaign around one of these pipelines, and a number of environmental organizations converged on a community, and so there was a lot of action around supporting that community and fighting the pipeline. And then afterwards, what is the relationship with that community? What were the circumstances that made that community vulnerable in the first place to the various things that are trying to be put there? And why? And how can we think about, again, holistic ways of addressing issues so that we don't instrumentalize communities towards aims that are predetermined by someone outside of the community, and B, that we actually aren't kind of making sure that we're working in partnership with communities towards self-determination. So instead of coming in and telling the community that they need to care about this, which they do, and they'll take action on it, coming in and saying, all right, what are the things that you're concerned about? What are the things that we have in common that we're trying to achieve? And how can we work together to capacitate self-determination leadership, and so the communities aren't always in the situation where things are happening to communities as opposed to communities actually being in the driver's seat. And so that's the kind of approach and analysis that we need to have as we're engaging with communities to ensure that we aren't continuing to just see communities in a single dimensional way.
Right. And Adriana and Ben and all of you, I'll get you all in this. The Biden administration, I've talked to Gina McCarthy, a climate advisor, Brenda Mallory, chair of the White House Council of Environmental Advisors, et cetera. And you sort of feel that there's all this action going on. I'd love your insights from your perspective in the NGO community of how can they better succeed. I assume all of you kind of like the tilt of this crowd. Maybe I'm wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. But how would they actually get more traction? And if you were sitting down with the president and his advisors and you wanted to give them a piece of advice on how to move the needle on climate and social justice, what would be the 2 or 3 things you might say quickly? Adriana?
Yeah, so I would say that we're on the right track.
And I know, Adriana, you did this for them, right? So,
yeah. I think,
are they listening to you? Are they listening to you?
I mean, one of the things that I would point out is that we are, this actually goes beyond the communities that we're talking about here. What we forget, and what I think we need to keep saying, and this is why it's not a fad, is that as we invest in our Black and brown communities and in our communities that have been historically oppressed and disinvested in, we are actually going to improve everyone's lives, because the impacts are going to benefit us. We're going to be creating jobs. We're going to be lifting people out of poverty. We're going to be investing in our economy, frankly, and that is what I think we often neglect in this conversation, is the fact that an investment in our communities and removing this layer of historical oppression, we're actually raising the bar for everybody, and we're raising all boats, as that saying goes. So I think that is what I would emphasize, and we need to continue to talk about how this does that. I think they're doing an excellent job, and it always bears repeating.
Ben, if you were going to give them a friendly critique and say, hey, this is how you can amp up what you're trying to do, what would it be?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I know we've talked about the Justice 40 initiative quite a bit already today. I think, keeping in mind that, equity is not just about the benefits or outcomes that accrue, but about engaging folks in the process, as we've talked about through this conversation. I think it's going to be really critical as the Biden administration moves forward with Justice 40 to ensure that community members, impacted folks, and really just, folks across the spectrum are included in that conversation. I also, I know, Steve, that you mentioned a few of the folks within the administration that you've been speaking with. I think I'm really excited about the Deputy Director of Energy Justice, Shalonda Baker, and Dr. Tony Reams, who are now, at the Department of Energy, really helping to craft and move forward with that Justice 40 initiative. I think they're also actively thinking about what are the metrics for success? How are we actually tracking data and the outcomes to make sure that we're moving forward with the commitments that we've made? And so I think just really leaning on that leadership is going to be really critical. And then more broadly across the policy spectrum, I think moving forward with ambitious policy ideas like a clean electricity standard and ensuring that those family supporting jobs that would be created by such a clean electricity standard are really equitably reaching communities. But there's a lot to be excited about. I think it's just a matter of getting it across the finish line.
Well, we have a great question for our audience in a second, but I want to get Jackie and Kim to tell us, because I really want to hear I want to have the Biden team. I'm sure someone up there is listening. What do you think they could do to increase the efficacy of these efforts on climate and justice? Kim?
I think that as we work with communities that have been disinvested in, the trust building is important. The time it takes to build the trust, to then get at the conversation, to hear solutions that they actually believe you care. Then on practical applications through housing, through food, things that in health, making health the center, so we're not caught up in these technical conversations that just go over the head of folks versus being real clear about what they experience, how we discuss it, and how we wrap climate and economic justice around these practical issues that they're dealing with every day, and then move towards solutions that have already been vetted or researched that work and scale them, but also do it differently this time.
Great. Jackie, quick thoughts?
Yeah, sure. We have to build competencies in reaching communities. As federal aid, when FERC had their Office of Public Participation that they're starting, and they had this consultative conversations, one of the key things that we were bringing to them is that they need to be better about. So many communities don't even know that FERC exists, much less what are the pathways to actually give input, much less how to even examine the various things that are being considered by FERC. And so that's just an example, and there's so many more, the Public Service Commission, Public Utilities Commission, and certainly the various programs and processes of the federal government. So we need to make sure that we're building those pathways, and not just to communities writ large, because even as we talk about disadvantaged communities in Justice 40, often we even then are kind of reaching the communities that have broadband, that have some institution that's tied in with the federal government already. We have to reach those communities that are not even on the map, that are not even on the margins at all, because they're just invisible to some, and these are the communities that we often find.
I'm so glad you've said that, because I'm kind of constantly seeing these cases where there are well-intentioned resources in certain places, and that surround sound goes out to like limited parts of the country, and then other parts of the country really know nothing. They're not connected in that, and that's why I think what all of you are doing is so important. We got a great question from Christina, and I can't wait for it. Christina?
Hi, my name is Christina Miri Rajan. I'm a primary student from GEMS Millennium School, Sharjah, UAE. It's a great privilege to be part of this energy efficiency and climate justice virtual event and to hear from many of the experts. My question is, how can the students take the most effective climate actions during this pandemic, even being in their limited surroundings?
So this is a first for us. This is a great question from a young student in Sharjah, UAE, asking what students could do. So, Jackie.
Yes. So I'll just point to what students are already doing. Students are doing some amazing, whether it's their digital campaigns to spread the word and really shift the narrative around what's possible and what's necessary and what's the audacious actions that we need to take. And students are in their localities, as we say, we're locked in certain places, but in other places, we are people are getting out there in outdoor ways of whether they're doing community cleanups or they're doing rallies in their communities. There's all these different ways, planting community gardens that are critical in the food insecurity that we're finding in COVID-19, but also critical to advancing climate change mitigation. And so I'll just stop there.
Ben, your thoughts?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. I think in addition to what Jackie mentioned, just continuing to learn and also having conversations. I think if there's anything that we know from, groups like the Sunrise Movement and others, it's that folks listen to young people. And I think that couldn't be, more true in family settings. And so I think if young people are learning about climate change, learning about the potential of this clean energy transition and sharing it with their family, sharing it with, others in their classes or their teachers, that really helps influence, where we're able to go. And I think can help change hearts and minds and really get everyone on the same path toward this clean energy transition.
Adriana?
Absolutely agree with Ben and Jackie. And it's the energy that children can bring to this is critical. Not only can they get outside and influence their parents, which is hugely important, but they are going to be designing the solutions of the future. So I think the best thing they can do is help us to make sure that this is not a fad, that we continue to talk about the importance of centering the needs of communities and looking towards the future. So I think that they can set an example. They don't see the same, at least here in the US, what we see is a move towards a much more diverse, much more inclusive model of activism than what we've seen in the past. And I think that they can bring that level of elevating the intersectionality between racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and climate injustice together in a way that we have not seen before. And I'm very excited about what the young people of the world, frankly, are able to do with that. So keep it up and remind us of the fact that these all go together, that to solve them all, solve one starts to solve the others.
Thank you for that. I'm going to give the last word to Kim Foreman, but I'm going to say to Christina that I think if I'm counting right, it's about 11 p.m. there. So I hope your parents have let you stay up to watch this or that you watch it later. So, Kim, last word.
Yeah, I've tried to model intergenerational and multi-sector teams to develop solutions so that we hear from everyone, we respect everyone, and don't separate them out, but bring them together. So you have all ages, some diversity around age, race, all of the and sector, so that we are all together crafting solutions. So I think it's important to include other generations and people. Look around the table. If there's someone there that's missing, being intentional of inviting them to the table to plan and participate.
And what I will say, just as the moderator to this, to Christina and to young people out there, is let everybody know around you, teachers, parents, companies, organizations, you have a role, you have a voice, that these issues matter. And that, I have to tell you that one of the things that may not be appropriate, because when you actually scratch beneath the surface on all the things you're talking about, Flint, Michigan, and what we saw with the water crisis there is something that is all over. What you're talking about is such a much broader swath of climate injustice. But for a lot of Americans, that was one they got in their head. They remember it was, one in the, but that is everywhere. And so, when you kind of look at the actions, the social action that occurred around that and the huge lift, well, I don't think it should have been that hard, but it was. I think young people can play a very big role in saying this stuff matters. So thank you so much for that great question. I want to thank Kim Foreman, Executive Director of Environmental Health Watch. Thank you so much. Ben Passer, Lead Director on Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy. Jackie Patterson, Founder and Executive Director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. And finally, Adriana Quintero, who is Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Energy Foundation. Thank you all so much. Great conversation. Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. A big thank you to Climate Action Campaign and to all of you attendees for joining this discussion. If you missed any of these conversations, and they're great, we will have the video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Think about the climate. Be well.